Day 4 of Lil Durk's federal murder-for-hire trial brought more than just another day of testimony. Investigators went deeper into the surveillance, vehicles, travel, masks, and the identification of an alleged shooter, but the defense also focused heavily on something that could become extremely important: how investigators interviewed the government's cooperating witnesses, and how many of those interviews were actually recorded. Here are the 7 things from Day 4 that actually matter. Day 4 of Lil Durk's federal murder-for-hire trial took the jury deeper into the investigation surrounding the August 2022 shooting that killed Saviolol Pab Robinson, and today wasn't about one single bombshell. It was about investigators explaining how they built the case, while the defense continued attacking the government's investigation and the credibility of the people expected to testify against Durk. Here are the 7 things from that day that stood out. Detective Warner Carias continued explaining the investigation and the evidence investigators used to identify people allegedly connected to the shooting. That included surveillance footage, vehicle movements, travel records, and information investigators obtained as they worked backwards from the shooting. The significance here is that the prosecution isn't simply presenting the shooting itself. They're trying to show the jury the investigative trail that allegedly connects the people involved. And that brings us to one of the more unusual pieces of evidence discussed. Investigators had surveillance footage of masked individuals connected to the shooting. The problem was obvious: they were masked, so investigators needed another way to identify them. One of the clues was a pair of pants featuring the words "Rats to Riches." Investigators later encountered surveillance showing a person wearing those distinctive pants after the shooting. That clothing detail became part of the process investigators used to identify DeAndre Wilson, also known as OTF DD. This is important because it shows how investigators tried to turn anonymous surveillance footage into an identification. The clothing itself isn't proof of murder. The significance is how investigators say that clue led them toward identifying a person they believed was connected to the shooting. Another major part of today's testimony involved vehicles. Investigators discussed the movements of vehicles allegedly connected to people involved in the case, including a BMW and an Infiniti. Also, GPS information and surveillance were used to reconstruct movements before and after the shooting. The government is using that information to establish a timeline. Where were the vehicles? Who was associated with them? Where did they travel? And how did those movements fit into the government's theory? Those questions matter because the prosecution is attempting to establish that these weren't random movements. They're trying to show the jury a coordinated sequence of events. Investigators also discussed 4 black ski masks allegedly purchased before the shooting. The government's evidence connects the masks to the alleged planning and preparation for the attack. Again, the important point isn't simply that someone purchased masks. Masks can obviously have innocent uses. The prosecution's argument is about the timing, number of masks, and how that purchase fits into the rest of the evidence. The government is essentially asking the jury to look at these individual pieces together rather than separately. Travel was another important part of today's testimony. Investigators discussed flights and movements involving people who allegedly traveled from Chicago toward California before the shooting. The prosecution is using those travel records as part of its timeline. The government wants the jury to consider who traveled, when they traveled, and what happened after they arrived. And that's important because the prosecution's case depends heavily on establishing a sequence. People traveled, vehicles were obtained, locations were visited, equipment was acquired, and then the shooting occurred. The defense, however, is challenging how those pieces should be interpreted, which leads directly into one of the biggest issues from Day 4. This was one of the most important parts of the day. The defense questioned Detective Carias about interviews investigators conducted with people who are expected to cooperate with the government. One name receiving particular attention was OTF Jam Hester. The defense raised the fact that Jam had been interviewed by investigators more than 30 times, but only a limited number of those interviews were recorded. That is significant. Why? Because Jam is expected to be one of the government's witnesses against Durk. And the defense can argue that when a witness gives investigators information over many different interviews, the jury should be able to examine how that person's story developed over time. If an interview isn't recorded, there isn't necessarily a complete recording for the defense and jury to compare. And this wasn't limited to Jam. The defense also questioned the handling of interviews involving other cooperating witnesses. That's important because the government is expected to rely on multiple cooperating witnesses, so the defense isn't simply saying don't believe these witnesses witnesses. They're also questioning the process by which investigators obtained and documented their statements. That could become increasingly important once those witnesses actually take the stand. And that brings us to the final major point from day 4. The defense continued challenging the government's portrayal of who was actually directing the operation. Their position is that Cave and OTF Vonni Grant played a much more central role in arranging the logistics than prosecutors have attributed to him. That includes allegations involving vehicles, lodging, masks, and other logistical details. The defense is essentially asking the jury to consider a different interpretation of the evidence. Instead of automatically connecting every logistical step to Durk, they want the jury to look at who was actually arranging and carrying out those steps. And that distinction could become extremely important as the cooperating witnesses begin testifying. Because eventually, the jury won't just hear detectives explain what investigators discovered. They're going to hear directly from people the government says were involved. And the defense is already laying the groundwork to challenge their credibility.